I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I'm scared shitless. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son, and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we bring weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun with me, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was only 3 years at the time. She and I were set on the edge from a park ranger who seemed very tense and uneasy to begin with, who stopped us and instead of confiscating our weapons told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself that there's no way, they're just fucking with us, but I knew better. So, when we reached the area we were going to set up camp, we immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby carrying backpacks and my son started to get real heavy about now. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if something had killed a buck. There was a whole outline in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man to do. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tent. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, we stayed inside the tent and my girlfriend put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint, rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance had unnaturally long limbs for a buck and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud, blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard, but to my surprise, the animal hadn't even moved an inch. And then I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me, deep into my eyes as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as if it knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt toward us? And just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. And I couldn't exactly tell what it was saying, but it seemed to have a, I need more children. My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere, and we told the rangers that he was missing, and they started up a search party. I explained what had happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe it. The one who seemed to be older, by at least a decade, pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly some rangers came into the cabin saying they could not find our son. My girlfriend started sobbing. I started to hate myself, thinking I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is we don't have our son anymore. God help whoever goes into that forest next, and please don't bring your kids with you.
On Thursday, February 17th, 2017, at around 16 to 1700, I believe I spotted a Wendigo in a wooded area behind my residence. I live in an area where Wendigos could and have been spotted, so I don't deny that it was a Wendigo. Anyway, I have found mutilated animals and horrible scenes of death, rot, and decay that would make even well-seasoned veterans throw up. The sights have been just horrifying, and this really supports my theory that something is back in those woods. For example, about 1 month ago, I found my second dead fox. Its head and spinal cord were about 30 feet downhill from the mangroves mess that once was the body. Its body had its front left leg ripped off and large scratches in its chest and sides. Furthermore, it was disemboweled with its intestinal tract in the trees and bushes. There were also signs of a struggle because fur from another animal and some sort of black liquid were on the ground and under its nails. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of details, but those should paint a pretty good picture for you. Now to the juicy part of my experience with this terrible spirit. So let me lay out the land for you. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that splits the wooded area in half. And on the far side of the stream, from my house, there are very large trees. So I was out there one day, and all of a sudden, I felt cold and uncomfortable, like I was being watched. I also became increasingly paranoid that someone or something was out there with me. So I decided to head in. Plus, the sun was setting and dusk would soon be upon me. So I was starting walking towards my house, which would mean I would have to walk uphill. So I start walking at first, and I was walking out of the woods like I was on someone's yard and they had told me to get off. Not a fast pace, but moving with a purpose, you know? Then I kind of felt like someone was really looking at me. So I turned around and saw a large creature, about 80 yards or less. I'm not really sure of how far my house is from that stream, from me standing across the stream. It then proceeded to take a step towards me. And I'm not really too athletic, but I'm not mega weak. I would saw that if I had to run about 20 yards uphill through the woods, it might take me 30 to 40 seconds. Yeah, I ran out of those woods in about 10 seconds flat. It is the most I have ever been scared, and the adrenaline has ever flowed through me. Now that I know what you're wondering, could I have been dehydrated or having hallucinations? Well, I've never hallucinated once in my life, and I was not dehydrated, because about 10 minutes prior to this, I drank an entire bottle of water, and I always make sure I'm hydrated before I go woodland exploring. And there's no way it was a tree, because every time I go out there, I go to where I spotted it. And there isn't a single tree small enough to remotely look like what I saw. Since then, I haven't spotted it, but I do hear it. It is believed by Native Americans that Wendigos call out for help just like a human would in order to lure people toward it. I have heard what sounds like a little girl calling for help out in those woods before. It is still terrifying to talk or think about. Could anyone please help me or tell me that I'm not crazy, because I feel like I am. Growing up in the mountains of northern Georgia, camping and hiking were things that me and my brother did so often it was second nature. So anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know where we were, and that was that. No questions asked. We decided to camp about midways through Jack's River Trail, and it's a trail we knew fairly well, as we had used to use it a few times before to practice on for long hikes. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got our gear out, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers as we moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall setting in, it was harder for the trail to stay dry. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule: we don't camp near people, if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents and into the woods to never be seen again. So we always camped a pretty decent spot ways off the trail and in the area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was the perfect place to set up for the 2 nights that we would be out. We came up to the Horseshoe Bend and ventured about a half mile off the trail into a clearing and set up there. We built a teepee fire lay for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of the many swimming holes Jack's River had to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather, or the fact that this was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, and settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close, and just enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior, and he was a sophomore, but growing up, we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups, played the same sports, and even the same hobbies, etc. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know we were safe and getting ready for bed, and I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having some awkward conversations we had each year with family we only saw on the holidays, when things start to get strange. We were no stranger to the sounds of woods, and these woods were full of animals, from deer to black bears and even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough, you learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing, I can only chalk up to as odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like somebody sneaking around slowly, just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on 4 legs, you hear a tighter group of steps, but what we were hearing sounded very distinct to what a bipedal human sounds like when walking slowly or trying to move without making too much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt the sounds were coming from. But that is what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot we thought the sound were coming from, the location of the sound would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us. That's when the whistling started. At first, I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we are hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes, over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I had heard that, and I put my finger to my lips, trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaw was tight, my fist clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was maybe 5 minutes when Ryan finally yelled out into the darkness, "Hey!" Quiet. The whistling stopped. The crunching of woods stopped. Nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a "what the hell" look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few moments, and when the woods erupted with noise. Something or someone was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was screwing with us. Nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. That's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud, inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police now. This is the part I will never forget, the part I never like to talk about. while Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes toward the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up directly in front of me, and for maybe 2 seconds, I saw it. Whatever this person or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light hit it, it launched backwards off of the tree. I heard it land, but it either jumped at an impossible distance or landed in a thicket because I heard it, but never saw. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I saw. And maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys came into view asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, a park ranger finally showed up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or maybe some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying there that night. We packed up our stuff and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement and we got in our car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back. After hearing stories and looking stuff up online, I'm fairly sure it was a Wendigo. Me, my son, and girlfriend were attacked by something. We were camping up in the northernmost area of Washington State. My girlfriend is incredibly superstitious, so she insisted we brought weapons. So I had my combat knife and a 12-gauge shotgun, and she brought a .22 rifle alongside a newly sharpened machete. Our son was just 3 years old at the time. She and I were set on edge from a park ranger, who seemed very tense and uneasy, who stopped us and, instead of confiscating our weapons, told us to be careful and stay safe, then sent us along our way to the camp. When we got there, we were informed that several visitors had spoken about some unnatural noises and a pale creature that would mimic voices and sounds of people who weren't talking or seeming to be distracted. I laughed and put the idea out of my mind, thinking to myself, there's no way. They're fucking with us. But I knew better. So, we then reached the area we were going to set up camp. We immediately got a fire ready to light and set up our tent and bags. I fed my son as my girlfriend ate a snack. We decided to get a lay of the area, so me and my girlfriend hiked around for about an hour or so. I had one of those baby-carrying backpacks, and my son started getting real heavy. Everything seemed normal until I saw something down the almost path we were on. We walked closer to investigate and saw drag marks. It looked as if somebody had killed a buck. There was a hole outlined in the dirt with a small dried pool of blood, as if someone grabbed it from the antlers and pulled. That wouldn't be possible for any man. The buck, or whatever it was, would have been way too big for that. Shaken, we rushed back to base camp and restarted the fire and hurried back into our tents. Too afraid to leave since it was dusk by now, and we stayed inside the tent, and my girlfriend and I put our son to bed. Eventually, probably from the exhaustion of fright, we fell asleep. What must have been hours later, I awoke to a faint rasping sound that sounded like a child crying. I gazed outside in confusion and saw the outline of a creature that seemed to be a buck, standing over something. It seemed to be about 20 feet away, but at a closer glance, had unnaturally long limbs for a buck, and was eerily tall. In sudden fear, I unloaded 2 shots into the creature and heard a loud blood-curdling cry. My girlfriend awoke screaming to the shots I had fired as I tried to explain what I had heard. To my surprise, the animal hadn't moved an inch. Then, I noticed the stains on the side of the animal. It looked like blood was running down the edge, and lots of it. It stared at me, deep into my eyes, as I became petrified with fear. A sinister feeling of dread fell over me, as if I knew I couldn't move. I thought to myself, what if it starts to bolt towards us? Just then, this tall, decrepit, demonic thing seemed to whisper something. I couldn't exactly tell you what it was saying, but it seemed to have said, "I need more children." My girlfriend screamed, asking where our son was. We blacked out. In the morning, we awoke to park rangers at our campsite. We didn't see our son anywhere. We told the rangers that he was missing, and they started a search party. I explained what happened, and strangely, they seemed to believe us. The one who seemed to be older by at least a decade pulled along the one we met earlier and whispered something in his ear. I only heard a single line, and I'm not even sure if what I heard was correct. It sounded like he said, "It's getting bolder." They didn't seem to want us by ourselves, so they waited with us while they continued the search. We stayed in a log cabin for 3 days with a forest ranger, when suddenly, some rangers came into the cabin saying they could not find our son. My girlfriend started to sob, and I started to hate myself, thinking that I could have done something if I wasn't frozen in fear. We rushed outside only to find some injured and frightened police officials. The rangers wouldn't tell us anything of what happened or what they saw, or why the cops were scared shitless. All we know is that we don't have a son anymore. I will never recover from this. A little backstory. I was 13 at the time, and I come from a family of native descent, and we believe in many things similar to the Wendigo and Skinwalker. The whistling woman like the La Llorona and alike. We also have what seems some would call spiritual gifts that allow us to see spiritual energy, like negative energy and evil spirits. These gifts are what allow us to see these creatures and spirits alike, as well as being able to have connection to God and His angels. We had been wanting to go to another camping trip for ages, and after some debate, due to some of my nephews catching a bad cold, it was finally arranged. After arriving at the site, it was normal than any other trip for the most part, except there were matte signs of bad luck, a terrible omen, dead birds on the drive, my 7-year-old brother almost falling outside of our moving car due to a lock malfunction, and during the last few days of the 2-week vacation, strange things started happening. Food, drawers, cabinets, doors would all be open, and random chairs and Tupperware would go missing. But we chalked it up to some rowdy teenagers at the other campsite, though we all knew it wasn't just some kids. This was some far more treachery, but no one wanted to admit that it wasn't as simple as wandering animals or some thieving people. Until some days later, when even stranger things started to occur, like hearing footsteps behind us stopping one step after we did, the feeling of being watched, and a strong rancid odor when being completely alone. Imagine feces mixed with hot, rotted meat and then thrown into a fire. Although these occurrences were a disturbance, it did not deter us from staying for the final 2 days, as we had been planning it for months. But one experience years ago, on the day right before our departure, still haunts me to this very day. I had been strolling through the forest while looking for firewood when I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. As this happened, it seemed that all life ceased around me because I could only hear my heartbeat and the lone, heavy footsteps approaching me. Then, I heard my name called from what seemed to be every direction, yet echoed from in front of me, while also coming from behind. The voice calling me was a harsh, raspy, animalistic in tone, imitations of my sister, who had just recently left the trip due to stress only a few hours ago. This had sent horrendous chills down my spine, so I ran the fastest that I've ever had back down towards the campsite, while I heard the twigs and leaves crunching behind me. I had finally reached the campsite when the footsteps suddenly stopped. I was relieved and slumped over to the cabin stairs when I slipped on a rock, slipping out of the makeshift fire. It had caused my head to go straight into it. The blazing force of nature had almost burned my face when I just stopped mid-fall. I hadn't gained my balance, but it was as if just somebody was hanging on to me and pulled me back. I'm not sure what it was, but my family suggests that it was my guardian angel, saving me from an early death. But after that experience, I have never been to the same campsite ever again, and didn't go camping for a few years after that. Still, what really scares me the most from back then was when we had been leaving the site. I looked back from the car window and saw a figure standing at the tree line staring at me. It was lanky and looked starved to the point of having its skin wrapping tightly against its bones. But when I looked onto the pathway, the footprints were completely gone. And as I blinked, we rounded the corner and it seemingly vanished into thin air. This has left me questioning, what is those woods and was it a reality? But when my sister asked me why I was so shaken, I told her what I experienced and her face went pale. A scary, gaunt figure had been watching us across the riverbank, and then it had noticed her and ran away on all fours at a fictional speed, she shakily said, staying quite frightened after.
This has left me feeling extremely shook up, and I'd love some opinions, especially from somebody with other experiences. Last year, I had a very strange experience in National Forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because it's isolate, so my dog can roam, and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy, rough drives into the parks sometimes and the lack of service. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road and kind of curling up a mountain around maybe 5 p.m. It was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling did not let up at all. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but didn't see anything at all. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in the dirt with gravel road. Yucca, my dog started to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost ever seen her or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled maybe? This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a little bit further with me grumbling. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself in being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a little bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I can find a good place to camp. I continue to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind no one is going to be more than 5 to 10 miles up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices though, and they sound close, and I think I should call out to them, so I stop my car, but then I kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make my way out of what they're saying, and I don't see any sign of people anywhere, and I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward and cautiously look where the voices could be coming from. I've never ran into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep in. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have a sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how Yucca was acting on the way down. I was scared and focusing on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain not seeing any sign of anyone, and I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself, and the voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die, glass gets broken, nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place, it just sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me as well as frightening. I recently happened across some information, as well as some Native American lore that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year, I've mentioned this place to a few people, and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. Googled the national park once and didn't see anything, but didn't look much either. I like scary movies and things of that nature, so my boyfriend and I were coming up on finishing a road trip just yesterday. There were only 2 to 3 hours left and the sun had set, so we decided to listen to some scary podcasts and YouTube videos. We went from the No Sleep podcast to the X-Files and ended up on a True Stories video dealing with Native American lore. I'm half paying attention, petting my dog, playing Pokemon on an emulator, and I hear the narrator mention Wendigos. Very briefly says what they are and casually mentions that they can mimic voices. I mean it when I say the most horrible chills I have ever had in my life crawl down my spine, and I stare at my boyfriend and ask him if he remembers that national forest I was freaked out about last year. He says he does, and he reminds me that he texted me. I was probably close to a Wendigo. I remember him saying that, but didn't know much more about their lore, and thought he was just being funny, like, yeah, Bigfoot is probably stalking you, or some other dad joke. And he was like, no, I mean, I was mostly joking, but I said it specifically because you said you were hearing voices that you couldn't find a trace of. I feel strange as hell, and I start Googling Wendigos. They are allegedly able to mimic human voices and would live in that sort of area. It all matched up. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable info out there, but I tried to more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is, another family goes missing in Mendocino. I went through the different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they are all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remember looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and realized that these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found, on top of many which are found dead. It just has my intuition super spiked. I remember just how feeling unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there, and it just terrifies me. I feel so uneasy about what I was hearing, and to this day, it still bothers me. My dog and I are very close, and she was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing her home from Costa Rica. So her little growls along the way makes me feel like there was something wrong. Even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I have done a lot of solo traveling, both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling, on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing anything more like solo traveling again, unless it's around civilization. I need to talk about this encounter somewhere, where people will finally know my story. On Thursday, February 17th, 2017, at around 1600 to 1700, I believe, I spotted a Wendigo in a wooded area behind my residence. I live in an area where Wendigos could have been spotted, so I don't deny that it was a Wendigo. Anyway, I have found mutilated animals and horrible scenes of death, rot, and decay that would make even the well-seasoned veterans throw up. The sights have just been horrifying, and this really supports my theory that something is back in those woods. For example, about 1 month ago I found my second dead fox. Its head and spinal cord were about 30 feet downhill from the mangroves mess that was once a body. Its body had its front left leg ripped off and large scratches in its chest and sides. Furthermore, it was disemboweled with its intestinal tract in the trees and bushes. There were also signs of struggle because from fur from another animal and some sort of black liquid were on the ground under its nails. Now, I'm leaving out a lot of the details, but those should paint a pretty good picture for you. Now the juicy part of my experience with this terrible spirit. So let me lay out the land for you. My house is about 100 yards from a small stream that splits the small wooded area in half. And on the far side of the stream from my house, there are large trees. So I was out there one day and all of a sudden I felt cold and uncomfortable, kind of like I was being watched. I also became increasingly paranoid that someone or something was out there with me. So I decided to head in. Plus the sun was setting and dusk would be upon me soon. So I started walking towards my house, which would mean I would have to walk uphill. So I start walking at first, and I was walking out of the woods like I was on someone's yard and they had told me to get off. Not a fast pace, but moving with a purpose, you know. Then I kind of felt like someone was really looking at me. So I turned around and saw a large creature about 80 or so yards away from me standing across the stream. It then proceeded to take a step towards me. And I'm not really too athletic, but I'm not mega weak either. I would say that if I had to run about 20 yards uphill through the woods, it might take me about 30 to 40 seconds. Yeah, I ran out of those woods in about 10 seconds. It is the most I have ever been scared in my life, and the most adrenaline has ever flowed through me. Now I know what you're wondering. Could I have been dehydrated or having hallucinations? Well, I've never hallucinated once in my life, and I wasn't dehydrated because about 10 minutes prior to this event, I drank an entire bottle of water, and I always make sure I'm hydrated before I go woodland exploring. And there's no way it was a tree because every time I go out there, I go to where I spotted it, and there isn't a single small tree enough to remotely even look like what I saw. Since then, I haven't spotted it, but I can hear it. It is believed by Native Americans that Wendigos call out for help like a human in order to lure people toward it. I have heard what it sounds like a little girl calling for help out in those woods before. It is still terrifying to talk or think about. Could anyone please help me or tell me that I'm not crazy?
I don't know whether this story will be scary to anyone reading this or not, but I've told those who think it's interesting enough for them to repeat this story to others. I'm a 17-year-old male, currently living in Hawaii. Lucky me, but as a child, I was raised in a Christian home in a rural part of Nevada. For as long as I can remember, I've had a fascination for the unexplained and paranormal. Unlike my Christian family, I do not believe in anything that I cannot see myself. Thus, up until recently, I only thought of the supernatural as a very ancient superstition, nothing to be afraid of or be concerned about. But like anyone else, I like a good ghost story. Some of the horrific stories that my friends would tell me would keep me up at night, not in fear, but in curiosity. I would always wonder what the meaning behind the phantom's actions would be, or even if there would be any reason behind them at all. If a shadowy figure stood across from you down the hall, what would he be trying to accomplish? Scare you and feed off your fear? Call out to you to help it pass over? Or is it doing that for no reason at all? This is what I was interested in, not so much of the terror aspect of it. On my free time, I would usually, and still do, watch YouTube videos about the paranormal. My parents, being Christians, were greatly concerned about this interest and afraid that I would invite something into our house and our lives. I didn't believe that. Thus, I continued my routine. About 4 years ago, when I still lived in my Nevada home, my 10-year-old sister, who we'll call Sarah for the sake of this story, was scared and asked if she could sleep in my bed with me. This was nothing out of the usual. Sarah was still afraid of the dark, and she believed that if she slept with me, nothing would happen, or if something did happen, she'd feel less crazy because I'd at least be there to witness it. Like the older brother I am, I allowed her to sleep with me. Sometime later, we got into an argument about something that I don't remember. I ended up feeling guilty and apologized about the fight, but Sarah decided to sleep in her room to spite me. I saw her leave and the way my bed was positioned. Couldn't see her after, and she had stepped out of my room. 10 seconds later after Sarah had left, she sprints back to my room, looking as pale as a ghost, leapt onto my bed and hid herself under my sheets and latched onto me with a grip I have never felt before. She began crying, but it wasn't her normal cry. It sounded like there was a force behind her cry, as if she wanted to cry as loud and as long as she could, but couldn't out of fear of being heard by somebody or something. And her breathing, it was rapid, irregular, and shallow, as if she was suffocating or drowning and reaching for air. I asked her what was wrong, but she never responded. I thought somebody was in the house, so I wanted to get up and check. I moved only an inch before Sarah held me even tighter and cried, "Don't go, please, don't go." I laid back down and tried to explain, but she talked over me and repeated this about 10 more times before I finally assured her that I'll stay here until she calms down. After about 15 minutes, Sarah was calm enough to talk. Now, however, she was shaking. I asked if she felt all right to explain what happened. Through tears, she explained the horror. When she had stepped out of my room, she saw someone standing in the room directly in front of her. The room was my older brother's, who had moved out 7 years prior. Sarah and I always seen this thing inside that room through the corner of our eyes, whether it be the day or night. But when we looked, nothing would be there. The figure looked like my father, and it just stood there, just enough inside the doorway for her to see its figure. It even appeared to have his exact clothes on. Its body was facing her. Its head was facing 90 degrees to her left, away from her. Once she had seen it, she realized that my father was at work, driving a semi-truck to Boise, Idaho for one of his regular runs. No other males besides me lived there. When she had realized these things, the figure slowly turned its head toward my sister, and while doing so, changed from my father's appearance into what she thinks was its own appearance. In her words, its hair was frizzy and had black and red streaks. Its eyes were glowing red, and it had no nose. Its skin was pale bluish, and you could see the veins, which were tar black. He was extremely tall and slender, with long bony arms reaching past his knees. His fingers had thick, long, and sharp nails that were stained with a black substance. It wasn't dripping off of his nails, it was like crusted on. It stood there, extremely straight and stiff, and just stared at me. It didn't say anything or even make a sound, and filled me with this almost paralyzing fear. Seeing this, she wanted to run to my parents' room down the hall, but she feared that she might not make it before this thing caught her. So, she looked quickly behind her to see if my door was still open so she can dash into my room. When she looked back, the figure was 2 feet closer to her, still retaining the same posture and unwavering stare. As soon as she saw this, she turned and bolted into my room. To her, these few steps into my room seemed and felt like a mile. She felt it get closer and closer with each step that she took. But right as she set foot in my room, she felt it stop or leave, but she never looked back to check. She then launched herself onto my bed and hid herself, latching onto me. Once she had finished her story, I wanted to believe that this was true and see it for myself, but somehow I knew that it wouldn't be there now. I thought about telling our parents about this, but who'd believe it? I knew they wouldn't believe. No parent ever does, or wants to when, of course, this sort of thing happens. "You just had a nightmare," they'd say, or "It was just your imagination." Thinking about their response got me doubting in Sarah's story. But the utter terror and exhausted look that my sister had made me dismiss my doubts. Eventually, we decided to tell our parents. I went first, of course, with her tightly hanging on behind me. When I left my room, I didn't see the figure, which I knew was going to happen and made me feel relieved and bummed at the same time. Upon reaching our parents' room and telling them about it, they said the exact things I predicted. My sister, once hearing their response, snapped and began yelling through sobs to them. What was I thinking? I should have never told you. You never would have believed unless you saw what I saw. I thought by telling you would comfort me, but instead you're sweeping it under the rug and telling me that I'm crazy. Sarah is a sweet and respectful girl. She never raised her voice at our parents, even if she wanted to. So this caught our parents' attention and fully woke them up. They realized through this outburst, my account of the event, that it was indeed true. My mother called a pastor. It was then 12:51 a.m. to come bless the house. The pastor came and prayed, burned incense and other rituals to cleanse our house. I didn't believe any of this worked, but it made my sister feel a little more at ease, so that made me feel better. My parents and Sarah never told anyone of this, still believing it could be some imagination, and I only told a few close friends when they would sleep over. Fortunately, we moved 2 years later to Hawaii, leaving that thing behind. Although other things, such as bowls falling out of the cabinets by themselves or random but ghastly screams, have happened, nothing has ever occurred before or after, and that was as serious as this. After this event, I wanted to know what my sister saw, so I searched online for what it could be. I thought that it could be a Wendigo, rake, or skinwalker, but all of those things would have killed my sister and probably all of us if it were any of these things. If you think you know what this could be, please let me know.
I have spent the past 2 summers guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, and I have had a few run-ins and heard many stories from other guides about their experiences. The beings have lived in this area for thousands of years, and there are many places that we cannot camp on because they are Indian reservations. I have heard this area is referred to as Wendigo country, and there are multiple places named after it, like the Wendigo Isles, for example. I have plenty of stories that have passed on by other guides, which are pretty terrifying, and I could share some with you if there is interest, but I will just share this one experience I was involved in. It was me, another guide, and we had about 7 kids with us on this trip. On the first night, we stopped after a long day of paddling at a campsite known as Little Triscuit. We had one camper with us that was somewhere on the autism spectrum and had big communication issues. As we were making dinner over the fire, he seemed to notice something in the woods behind us. He kept saying things along the lines of, "Who is that man in the woods?" and described it as a tall, skinny man that was all white. We assured him that there was no one there, and that we did a head count to make sure that everybody was here. So, we checked it out and we didn't see anything, so we just brushed it off and went back to making dinner. The same night, a different camper was in her tent by herself because she was the only girl on our trip. As me and my co-guide were starting to fall asleep, we heard her say, "Gilly Vanilli, stop." We replied with, "What? We're in her tent." And she just brushed it off and went to bed. In the morning, we asked her what was up, and she said that something was shaking her tent, and she thought it was us. It wasn't a windy night. The boys were all in their tents, and we were in our tents as well. When we took her tent down, we took the stakes out, and 2 of them were completely bent at a 90-degree angle. We tested out the flexibility, and we couldn't move and get the thing to budge back at all. I've been in some crazy windstorms out there, probably with winds of around 30 to 40 miles per hour, and had never seen a stake bend like that. But we left Little Triscuit and the weird stuff stopped happening, and we had an awesome trip afterwards. When we got back to base camp, I talked to another guide that stayed at the same campsite the night after, and without me saying anything, she told me there is some sort of big white creature at that campsite. She told us that she was going to the bathroom way back in the woods and thought that another camper had accidentally came to her bathroom spot and ran away, but when she got back, everybody was there and nobody had even left the fire in the time that she had left. There are much scarier stories and experiences other guides have been involved in with these spirits up here. Ever since I could remember, I've loved hunting. Squirrels, deer. It started as something my father and I did together, but when he died, I couldn't help but see myself out there more and more. It was his favorite thing to do, and I was lucky enough to be a part of it with him. God knows I miss him so much. After the following experience, though, I'm scared to head back out to the woods. It was a snowy Saturday morning looking back, and the sun had just come up. That day I had been hunting squirrels, but the woods were deathly quiet and still. I sat silently under the skeleton of an old oak tree. Whether or not I saw or killed anything didn't matter. The best part was the beauty. Waking up early and soaking it all in was worth every second of quiet and coldness. Everything was suddenly stirred to life by a gruff, grunting sound. The noise was similar to a butt call at first, but so much lower and guttural. At first, I thought a massive buck was dying in the snow. Then it came again, but close enough to make my blood run cold. Whatever it was wasn't dying. It had moved an impossible amount of distance within those few seconds. I honestly had no idea what I was hearing. I did the only thing I could do, and I sat still and tried not to breathe. Only moments later, I saw something that has changed my life in the worst way possible. The head of a deer with a sickly look and eyes with way too much white appeared from behind a tree 15 yards in front of me. It was motionless, and worst of all, the damn thing was 9 feet off the ground, and I've never seen any deer that tall. This thing looked like it had just been in a fight while fighting off a deadly virus. It wasn't a pretty sight to see. When a clawed hand appeared just below it, I knew this was no deer. It sounds like something out of a children's book of scary stories, I know, and I wish that was all true, but these bony fingers curved around the trunk of the tree, disgusting nails sliding along the bark. The way its head was angled, it was as if it was staring at me, into my soul. Instinct then took over. I grabbed my gun and I ran as quickly as possible back to my truck. I had never ran so fast before in my life, but somehow I still ran faster when I heard that grunting again. Closer and closer it seemed to come, no matter how far I ran away. When I reached my truck, I opened and slammed the door shut. I started it and floored the damn thing. But before I really took off, I made one mistake. I glanced into the woods. As if it had been copied and pasted, that thing's decaying head and clawed hand were now protruding from a pine tree at the forest's edge. I'm sorry, Dad, but I don't know if I'll ever be going back there ever again. One summer, about 5 to 6 years ago, Stephen had a couple of encounters with a Wendigo. His first encounter was on an earlier trip in the summer where their destination was into Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip which had about 60 miles of paddling and one portage, taking your packs and canoes over land into another lake, into Shoal. On day 4, they were portaging back out of Shoal through a portage called Dead Man's Portage. Sounds made up from some horror story, right? But the portage from Lake of the Woods into Shoal is called Dead Man's Portage. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called this campsite Dead Man's. Stephen and his trip left Shoal Lake, aiming to get through Dead Man's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of a portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even cleans out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just a surreal, beautiful paddle the whole entire way. It's through a little inlet with about 10 to 15 foot high cliffs on both sides, covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Stephen and his trip got to Dead Man's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they'd left their sleeping bag pack at the end of the portage. It was around 9 or so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Stephen and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps to quickly retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about half an hour, and at this point, you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the pack and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Stephen started to hear loud splashes of things falling in the water, trailing behind them He quickly dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in the area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Stephen looked behind him to see a huge rock the size of a basketball come flying at him and land in the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant super heavy rocks at them. Stephen looked back between paddles, and on one of the cliffs about 15 feet up he saw two distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped coming at them and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other encounters, but I never feel too great about going through Dead Man's Portage, and triple check that I don't leave any packs there when I do.
Just to start off with some backstory, my group of friends had started making a nasty habit of joking about the Wendigo. My friend Stacy and me didn't for a while, just due to the fact that we believed in the supernatural, but after a few months, it grew on us, not knowing that the Wendigo can actually be triggered by such things. We joined in, which was the biggest mistake ever. I had just moved into the country, and we enjoyed making trips into town to have a few drinks, which is about a 30-minute walk from my place to town. At night, the first 10 minutes after leaving the bridge that leads out of town is pitch darkness with no streetlights. After that, streetlights are very sparsely placed, which can cause for a very creepy walk without anything happening. So, with all that in place, let's continue. Stacy and I began our night walking into town, get some beers, and have some fun. Shortly into the night, something slightly strange happens. We receive a phone call from her little sister at home, crying and scared because she saw someone sitting on my friend Stacy's bed. She calms her sister down and asks her cousin to check her room for her sister at home. Everything is fine. No one's in the room. Also, ghosts and weird things happening at her house were also very common, so a sighting like this was a very strange regular. We continue our night. Into the night, we meet a guy who seems pretty cool. He's riding a bike and tells us he's pretty drunk or something. We decide to hang out with him for a bit, and wanting to meet people in town. A ways into our hangout, we are sitting on a park bench, and the guy is just lying on the ground in front of us. Suddenly, my friend stands up and says it's time for us to go. I shrug and agree, and we get going. After getting away from him, she tells me the guy bit her ankle. The day after, she said she had teeth bruises on her ankle. Kind of flustered that the guy would do that, we continue our walk out of town. Finally, we pass the bridge, which is our last source of light for the next 10 minutes. We turn on our phone flashlights, and we turn on some music, trying to ease the spooky feeling of being in pitch black darkness in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, we hear a voice beside us, and we both jump. It's the same guy on his bike. He asks us if he can follow us until we reach the fork in the road. We need to go left, and he needed to go right. Still slightly creeped out, but almost at the streetlights and the fork in the road, we agree. Regardless, he had to go the way, so did we. After a bit of walking, we finally reach the fork in the road and the first streetlight. We sigh with relief, hoping he would leave, but he turns down our way instead of going the way he needs to go. And now at this point, we are thoroughly creeped out. We try to ignore it and keep walking, holding our breath, wanting to reach the next streetlight, which in some ways was away. Finally, after what felt like forever, we reach the next streetlight, which is also for some reason a small graveyard. I hate my area. Once we reach the streetlight, the guy stops dead in his tracks and doesn't move any further past it. As we turn around, the guy looks like he has suddenly passed out on his bike, his head down and his shoulders slumped. I was about to say something, but my friend stopped me and said we really needed to leave him. I agreed, not wanting to be around him much long either. After a few seconds, I take a peek over my shoulder. He's gone, vanished. The worst part is, even if he had turned around and started pedaling as fast as he could, we still would have been able to see him some ways down the road. I panicked, but also slightly relieved he wasn't there anymore. We continue walking, trying to pretend we are not creeped out. Walking quickly from streetlight to streetlight, and finally, we reach my driveway. My driveway is a long road of darkness. We hadn't put any lights in yet to try and brighten it. We begin to walk slowly, holding our breath, some weird feeling of dread coming over me the closer and closer we got to my house, and the further into the driveway we entered. I don't know what came over us, but the sudden feeling of, you need to run, and you need to run fast, came over us at the same time. We took off bolting at the exact same time without having to say a word to each other. We got to my front door. I unlocked it quicker than I ever have before, and we get inside. Just as I'm about to close the door, this hellish scream or growl, whatever the sound is, came out of nowhere. I could hear it getting close to the door and steps, so I slammed the door closed and locked it, dropping to the ground in fear. We both sat there, holding our breaths, scared to even breathe. Fast forward a couple weeks. Me and my Stacy had forgotten about what happened. Suddenly, it came up in conversation, and we had tried to find the sound we heard. Nothing worked. We looked up every possible animal, even animals that weren't likely. We spent an hour on this until we decided to look up the sound of a Wendigo. It was the only sound that fit perfectly. We don't joke or talk about it now. I won't. I hate to. Even writing this post made me feel scared to bring it up. I'm a 30-year-old male and have dealt with strange encounters all of my life, ranging from a basic kidnapping attempt to a haunting demonic presence that felt like it would bring an entire house down on top of me. My wife and friends have always called me things like a magnet for trouble or a lightning rod for the weird, which is fair seeing as these kinds of people and situations do seem to be drawn to me and those who are close to me. I usually just listen to stories on YouTube, but I was goaded by my best friend into contributing some of my own experiences. I decided to start with a few of my personal favorites. Around the ages of 18 and 19, I like to go camping and hiking every so often. Living in the northwestern United States did nothing to put me off from doing so. In fact, I kind of found the cold, damp daringness calming in a weird sort of way. Spending a decent amount of time outdoors, I would occasionally meet like-minded individuals, some of them Native American. I grew up somewhat close with a small group of Native guys around my age, possibly 3 or 4 years older, and after running into them a few times, they took notice of how I was respectful of my surroundings, or at least that I was not an entitled glamper. I guess this gave them a reason to invite me to join them on one of their outings over the weekend. Let's call them Wolf, Hawk, Bear, and Ted to make things easier. I met up with them at the edge of the forest before sunrise. We all shared the preference of getting an early start, as well as getting as far away from civilization as we could, within reason. We hiked between 30 to 60 minutes before we found a decently wide, flat area and set up camp. The remainder of the day was spent drinking lightly, sharing past experiences, identifying bird calls, and me listening to some of their cultural stories and legends. It was well after sunset when the event occurred. Wolf got up to answer the call of nature and wandered off through the trees. After he was out of sight, I decided that I might as well take care of my own burden, having hoped that it could have waited till morning. Up until then, I made sure to let rest of them and know that I was going number 2 so they wouldn't worry if I was gone longer than our other companion. I ventured out farther than I would have had I needed to take a leak, not wanting one of them to stumble upon me while in the middle of my business. I had just done my belt up and turned to return our campsite when I thought I heard something in the distance. I frowned, tilting my head and straining my ears to see if I could catch whatever it was again. "Help!" Someone cried out. It was soft, so I couldn't tell exactly which direction it was coming from, but it sounded like a male's voice. "Hello?" I called back, eager to lend a hand to anyone who was lost or possibly injured. "Help!" The voice repeated, a little closer now. I took a few steps in the direction I thought the voice might be coming from, sweeping my flashlight around the area. "Are you lost?" I shouted into the darkness. "Lost," came the reply, even closer than before. I found it a little strange that they responded with only one word, but maybe I had missed the rest, or maybe they didn't know English very well. Either way, that was enough for me to take a few more quick, determined steps towards the voice. But I was stopped dead in my tracks by the next thing I heard. "I'm lost," it shrieked, drawing out the word in what sounded like a human yelling, mixed with the high-pitched scream of a deer or an elk. I felt goosebumps raise wherever they could as I muttered to myself, "What the hell?" I took a couple more slow steps, my flashlight darting from place to place until I heard twigs and brush being disturbed from the direction of our campsite. I whipped around while drawing my hunting knife to be met with the sight of Wolf, wearing a stern but concerned expression. I relaxed and sighed in relief before trying to explain about the voice I had heard and how we should go out and see who or what is out there. He just grabbed my upper arm and stoically began dragging me back through the trees. I didn't resist, but I kept trying to make a case for at least attempting to rescue the person out in the woods. His response was chilling. "I heard them too. Ain't no person out there, man," he mumbled. I was too dumbstruck to say anything else until we got back to the rest of our group. Once within sight, they began clapping and hooting a little, raising their cans of beer as they shared a laugh. "Wendigo almost got the white boy, did he?" Bear asked. Wolf responded by shaking his head, his eyes widening as he exhaled with his cheeks slightly puffed up in that was too close kind of way. At this point, I'm sure it was one of their friends helping them play a prank on me, so I called them out on it. They laughed a little more and Hawk said, "Look around, we're all here." It was true that the four of them weren't really social with many others, but I was convinced that wasn't proof enough. What happened next was. We had been talking about this for nearly half an hour before they all froze and then sprung into action, dismantling and packing up camp faster than I had ever seen, almost as if it were a sport and they were its star athletes. I tried asking what the hell was going on, but all I got was Hawk hissing, "Listen!" not even slowing down in what he was doing. I stood still and tried to tune out all the rustling, thumping, and clanking as best as I could. Eventually, my ears picked up on something. It was a kind of deep chittering or clicking, similar to the sound a predator makes, coming from the same direction I had gone to use the facilities. I was only standing there for a few seconds before I was snapped out of it by Bear handing me a length of rope with a D-link on the end. "Hook it on your belt. Can't afford to get separated," he said. His eyes focused on the brush past me. I took it and did as he said, following them to the side of the camp closest to the way back to our cars before they threw a couple of buckets of dirt over the fire. As soon as it was smothered, Wolf said we needed to get out of the forest as fast as possible. We didn't run, being hooked all together, but we walked quickly and half-jogged the whole way, turning what had been around a 45-minute journey before into a 20-minute one. The mood seemed to lighten up immediately after we emerged from the forest, the rest of them laughing and catching their breath as if we had just come out the other end of a perilous ordeal, me still feeling a little lost on what had just happened. We set up camp again on the grass near our cars. No fire this time, just lanterns. Once we were all settled, I asked Wolf if they really thought Wendigos were real, and if there had actually been one out there hunting me. They all went quiet as he explained. The truth is, we don't exactly know what it is, he said with a shrug. All we know is that they use the voices of peoples or animals to lure their prey. Then, clapped his hands, they ambush it. I felt a bit queasy, wondering how close I had been to being attacked. A new thought came to my mind. I get that it calls for help if it knows people are around, but what was that noise before we packed up? He looked back at me grimly. That's how they communicate with each other. I shuddered, further disturbed by the thought of more than one of those things stalking me. We spent the rest of the evening trying to recover what little good vibes were still to be had that weekend, talking about how we could circle around to a far part of the woods to ensure a good distance between us and those things. Unfortunately, our spirits were severely dampened by yet another cry from the woods. "Why won't you help me?" It screamed, jarring us all out of our mirth and forcing us all to lock our eyes on the tree line. Huh, they followed you all the way here. Bear quipping before turning to look at me. I guess they have a taste for white meat, he said with a grin. Don't worry, Wolf said quietly, gesturing to our surroundings. There's no cover here. They won't leave the forest. My eyes didn't leave the trees. You sure? I asked. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Wolf nod his head to the side slightly. Pretty sure, he replied, a hint of doubt in his voice. Needless to say, I slept in my car that night.
Growing up in the mountains of North Georgia, camping and hiking were things me and my brother did so often it was second nature to us. So, anytime Ryan and I had a break from school, we would head straight for the woods. We packed our gear, let our parents know we were going, and that was that, no questions asked. We decided to camp about midways through Jack's River Trail in Cool Water Wilderness, and it's a trail we knew fairly well, as we had used a few times before to practice long hikes on. We arrived at the trailhead around lunchtime, parked the car, got out our gear, and headed into the woods. We passed a few hikers and moved along and asked them how the trail looked, and the answer was always the same: wet. Jack's River Trail probably crossed the river 50 times as it went along its 17-mile-plus journey, and with the colder temperatures of late fall settling in, it was harder for the trail to stay dry. We moved deeper into the trail and started to look for a place to make camp. This is where Ryan and I made our first mistake. You see, Ryan and I have this rule: we don't camp near people if at all possible. Call us paranoid, but the last thing we want is for someone to drag us out of our tents into the woods to never be seen again. So we always camped a pretty decent ways off the trail and in an area that wasn't popular with overnight camping. Roughly 2.5 hours or so, we found what we thought was a perfect place to set up for 2 nights that we would be out. We came up to Horseshoe Bend and ventured about half a mile off the trail into a clearing and set up. We built a teepee fire late for that night and pitched our tents on either side. After setting up and unloading, we decided to walk back to the trail and go exploring around some of the many swimming holes Jack River has to offer. This was during Thanksgiving break, and I remember being surprised at how few people were on the trail. Maybe it was the weather, or the fact that it was early in the week, but there didn't seem to be anyone hiking, much less staying the night. Around 5 o'clock, Ryan and I headed back to camp to start our fire, make dinner, etc., and just settle in for the night. As soon as the sun began to set, the cold rushed in. We added more wood to the fire, sat close, and just enjoyed conversation. Ryan was 2 years behind me in school. I was a senior and he was only a sophomore, but growing up, we had always been close. We always hung out in the same groups and played the same sports, had the same hobbies, etc. Around 9, we were settled comfortably around the fire. I had just texted our mom to let her know we were safe and getting ready for bed, and I remember we were talking about dreading going to our grandparents' house for Thanksgiving and having the same awkward conversations we would have each year with family we only saw on holidays when things started to get strange. We were no stranger to sounds in these woods, since the woods alone are full of animals and critters, from deer to black bears, even the random wild boar. If you are in the woods enough, you learn to distinguish certain sounds, and what we were hearing I can only chalk up to as odd. What Ryan and I heard was what sounded like someone sneaking around slowly, just out of eyesight. With an animal walking on four legs, you hear a tight group of steps, but what we were hearing sounds very distinct to what a human sounds like when walking slowly, or trying to move without making too much sound. I remember we both pulled out our flashlights and shone it in the direction we felt sounds were coming from. But that is just what was so weird. Whenever we would fix our lights on a spot, we thought the sound was coming from the location we shined on, and then the sound location would suddenly change. It was as if there were multiple people walking around us, and that's when the whistling started. At first I thought it was the wind, and I remember thinking maybe the wind is just throwing leaves around, and what we were hearing is nothing but the wilderness around us. Ryan looked at me and asked if I was hearing that. I didn't answer and was trying to focus hard on each individual sound. 2 consecutive notes with roughly a 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes, over and over again. Ryan kept asking if I heard that, and I put my finger to my lips trying to keep him from talking. The fear I felt was incredible. My jaws were tightened, my fists clenched, knowing I wasn't ready for whatever was out there, if it was anything at all. The whistling continued for what felt like forever, but thinking it through was maybe 5 minutes with Ryan finally yelled out to the darkness, "Hey!" Quiet. The whistling had stopped. The crunching of wood stopped, nothing. I was pissed. I looked at Ryan with a "what the hell" look, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I had to do something," he said. I just shook my head. We sat there in silence for a few minutes when the woods erupted with noise. Something, or someone, was running in a circle around our campsite. The whistling came back. 2 consecutive notes with the same 3 to 4 second gap, and then 2 more consecutive notes. How could someone whistle this loudly without cracking while also running? I was done. I stood up, shining my flashlight in all directions, just trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was scurrying with us. But nothing. It felt close enough to touch, but we never saw a thing. And that's when the movement stopped, but the whistling was still constant. It was so loud, inhumanly loud. I looked at Ryan and told him to call the police now. Now this is the part that I will never forget, the part that I never like to talk about. While Ryan was on the phone with the dispatcher and telling them our location and what was going on, I stepped around the fire towards my tent. Inside my bag, I had a 6-inch fixed blade that I always carried and thought I would feel a bit more comfortable with it in my hand, more than just my flashlight. As I went to unzip my tent, trying to keep my eyes towards the woods, I heard some movement directly in front of me. I swept my light up in front of me, and maybe 2 seconds I saw it. Whatever this person was or thing was, it was about 5 feet up in a tree. Everything about it was long. Its arms, legs, neck, fingers, everything. And it was fast. As soon as the light launched backwards off the tree, I heard it land, but it either jumped on an impossible distance or landed in a thicket, because I heard it but never saw. I don't think I have ever yelled so loud. I ran back to where Ryan was and sat down. He kept asking me what I saw, but I just couldn't answer. I just kept thinking about what I had seen. And maybe 10 minutes later, we saw a couple of flashlight beams coming through the woods, and about 3 guys had come into view asking if everything was okay. I settled a bit and started asking them if they had seen or heard anything. All they said was they heard a lot of movement and then heard my scream, and that's when they headed in our direction. I tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy, but it didn't seem to work. One of the guys walked around a bit and came back and said he didn't see anything at all. Ryan told them that we called the police, and roughly 30 minutes later, the park ranger had finally shown up. Ryan and I tried explaining everything to him, but he just chalked it up to either a curious animal or some campers trying to mess with us. Either way, Ryan and I decided we weren't staying the night, and we packed up our stuff and walked out of the woods with the ranger. He took our statement, and we got into the car and drove home. Ryan and I don't talk about what happened that night, but neither of us have been back to Jack's River Trail and will probably never go back.
This happened during my first semester of my sophomore year of college. It was winter at this time, so snow was everywhere, and the moon was usually blacked out by clouds. I lived and went to college in the Black Hills. For those of you who don't know, it's a giant national forest made up of dense pine trees. It also overlaps with a Native American reservation land and was the site of many confrontations during Indian relocation, which is important to remember. Finally, Like many college students, I like to let loose and have a little bit of fun every now and then. On this particular night, my friends and I had thought it would be chill to drive through a nearby scenic canyon just right outside of town, smoke a bit of weed, and look at the stars. We accomplished the first two tasks, the second which was done with great enthusiasm. But it was hard to look at the stars because clouds were drifting across the sky and blocking most of it. This is where the story actually takes off. There were 5 of us in total that night. I and one other friend just wanted to head back to campus and maybe play some video games, chill for the rest of the night. The other 3 thought it would be a great idea to find a random trail and take a night hike through the forest. Since majority rules, we went with that option and found a pretty secluded area with several trails rounding through dense parts of forest. We all got out, grabbed some blankets from the truck to wrap around ourselves because it was just so dang cold, picked a trail at random, and started. Now, to tell you the truth, I am a pretty jumpy individual that gets spooked easily. Compound that with my heavy anxiety, darkness, and weed, and you have one scared girl that just wants to go home. I did not say anything to my friends, however, because they were having a good time and I didn't want to ruin their fun. We had been on the trail for about 20 minutes and had been using the lights on our phones because, again, the night sky was obstructed by clouds. The trail wasn't even halfway done at this point. My friend at the front of the group stopped suddenly and flashed her phone up to the trees on the side of the trail in front of us, just a few yards. She said, "Do you guys see that?" We all copied her and flashed our phones up there. At first, I thought she was just hallucinating, but then a shape started to take form. My initial reaction was that it was a bobcat, since it was lower to the ground than a mountain lion and seemed to be crouching. One friend shouted, "Oh crap, it's a deer! I was scared for a second." Another one said, "No, it's a rabbit." No one seemed to be able to pinpoint what it was or what size it should be. As we were arguing what it was, it turned its head towards us and its eyes flashed in our phone lights. Look, I gotta tell ya, I have been hunting all of my life, had all types of cats, dogs, cattle, you name it around me as I grew up. This means I have seen quite a few animals and now how their eyes glow, either from predator or prey. This thing, its eyes were both of that an animal and completely different, that I did not know what on God's green earth this was. It was not human, animal, or anything I had come across before. It chilled me more than the cold of winter ever could. After it turned towards us, my friends had died off in their arguing and had begun what I can only describe as a sick, terrifying sort of stare-off between all 5 of us and this creature. Then it did something that I will never forget for as long as I live. It stood up. I had thoughts about it being a bobcat. My friend thought it was an animal that varied in size, but nothing extraordinarily large. As it stood, it kept going higher and higher and higher until it reached what I assumed to be at least 7.5 to 7 3/4 of a foot, if not larger. I assume it was larger because as soon as it hit that mark, my friends and I all started screaming and sprinting back the way we had come. A trail that took us 20 minutes to stumble through in our state took us only 5 when we were running like our lives depended on it. We all dove into the car, the driver floored it, and we sped all the way back to campus. After catching our breaths, we kept asking each other, like, what the hell was that thing? Did you see it? And was that for real? That night, we all recollected what we saw, solidified that it was not just some hallucination, and decided it was some sort of animal, and agreed to move on with our lives. Only I can't. My friends all told me it was just a bear, to not worry because we had gotten away. I can't believe it. That thing, from what I had seen of it, what emaciated and had protruding bones under its skin. I couldn't see if it was skin or fur, just its silhouette, shadows behind it, and flashes of its build. Also, it was in the middle of winter. No bears would be out, and they also never ventured to this part of the Black Hills. Remember how I mentioned reservation land around the area? Well, even though I myself am not a Native American, I had grown up on a reservation of the Lakota Sioux, the same tribe that inhabits parts of the Black Hills. They have many myths and folklore about various creatures that live in the hills. I took it upon myself to think back on some of the legends that I was told growing up, and also asked some of the elders from the tribe that I knew. They gave me some possible answers. In fact, I will tell you two of them. The first one is an innocent, if not familiar character from the Lakota legends. He has a name I can't quite pronounce. It's quite strange. He is their version of Bigfoot. Tribe members and storytellers debate whether or not this is a singular creature or an entire species, but all the same, it is mostly harmless, being that it just wanders the forest and can act as an older brother in native stories. Altogether, it would not have been that terrifying if that's what was on the trail that night. However, I unfortunately have to side with the next creature as being the probable one we met. There is a malicious spirit in the Lakota myth called Doubleface. He takes the shape of a man, sometimes an animal, sometimes something in between. He is also described as looking like an ogre, but I'd like to keep Shrek out of this. His front face is that of a human, if a bit disfigured. If you see this one, you are fine, but do not stick around. He will try to convince to take a peek at the face on the back of his head, which, once you look at it, will paralyze you or kill you with a single glance. If it does not kill you, Doubleface will finish the deed by beating you to death or eating you alive. That's a common theme in a lot of Native American lore. Cannibalism. I ruled out Wendigos because if it had been one, I would not have been alive to tell you the story. You may think it's ridiculous that I am putting so much credence on these supposed myths, but until you have seen what I saw in the dark of night in the Black Hills, sat at a campfire with elders as they blessed you with sage, and listened as they provided you with both answers and cautionary forward movings, you will never understand how terrifying it is to realize that not all legends stay in stories. I used to live out in the country in Manitoba, Canada, like the real boonies. You had to bike or drive to go anywhere, aside from a railroad-side ice cream parlor. At night, it would get pretty dark too. With my mother and stepdad, we had 3 small dogs and a cat. I was often left in charge of all of them, was kind of resentful for all the work on top of schooling and homework, but I loved the animals, so I couldn't blame them too much. Unless they made a huge mess, then I'd be pretty ticked. But that's not entirely relevant. What is that I would routinely take them all out before going to bed. And I would go to bed very, very late at night, like any 14-year-old with such lax parenting would. Emma, Lady, and my dog Carmelita would usually stay in the front yard, which was a vast acreage of flat land with a tiny ditch. It was easy to see the small dogs and call them back in. Sometimes Emma would wander. My mother's Cairn Terrier had a bit of a rebellious side to her, but it wasn't her who took off this night. It was Lady, the Cocker Spaniel. She was protective and the watchful eye, while the others were mostly divas. Frustrated, I ran after her around to the back of the house, which is a steep slope toward a waterbed that is an offshoot of the Red River. What I saw slowly sprawling across the slope still gives me chills. These things were about chest height to me and 20 feet away. Pale tan or gray mostly, no tails, no muzzles, but on all fours with long legs that were longer in the front. They turned their almost featureless faces up to us at the top of the slope. Their eyes were large and glowed in the faint back porch lights like big marbles. Luckily, Lady had frozen at the top with me, her hackles raised like a hyena. The creatures were still walking but were bobbing their heads about looking at us. I grabbed the dog by crouching quickly, frightened we'd be attacked, and bolted around the side to the front again, calling for the others to come inside. Emma and Carm were already sitting at the door waiting. I guess they figured it was too chilly for them to stay out for so long, but truthfully, My out-of-shape self was boiling from the adrenaline. I refused to take them out after dark after that, which, unfortunately, resulted in plenty of messes I had to clean up. I would occasionally see those strange things crossing our backyard after that. They'd only look up at my house if I had the lights on, and was obviously moving in clear view. Another night I woke up, radio flashing 1 a.m., or something close to that. I wasn't sure why I woke up at the time until I realized I wasn't alone. I sleep in the basement at the time. My window overlooked the backyard, but only slightly. It was located under the back porch, which was able to be walked under if you simply stooped a bit. One of those things with pale skin and huge green eyes lowered its head as it looked in through my window. I froze. I'm not even sure if I moved at all after waking up. It sort of bobbed its head around for a brief time only, and then quickly bolted off as if something had frightened it. To this day, I have no idea what they were. They almost acted like deer, but they hardly looked like them. Their bodies looked closer to misshapen dogs or humans. Their faces were hard to see, but from what I could tell, they had no muzzles and very big eyes. I tried looking up what cryptids or myths were native to where I live, but everything just sort of points to Wendigo or skinwalkers, and I'm not entirely sold on either. I saw them too frequently for them to be a random misinterpretation of another animal, and aside from simple distance making it hard to discern their faces, they stuck around long enough for me to get a really good look at their form. So what the hell was I seeing out there?
I'm the sort of person who is skeptical of any claims regarding the existence of the supernatural. My wife claims to see ghosts and dead people and that she's an empath, and I'll concede that she's a very good guesser regarding other people's emotions and the history of places and families, but I can't accept her statements as fact because they're not empirically provable. With that said, you can believe me or not, but what I'm about to say is something that even I have a lot of trouble disbelieving. I can't say I've had any paranormal experiences in my life, but there are several things that happened when I was quite young that I simply can't explain. By the time I was about 12 to 18 months old, I had either a memory or a very vivid imagination of my life before birth. I was floating up in the sky, standing on thin air, with no land in any direction. In front of me was a kindly made, middle-aged Native American man wearing a plain white robe. He asked me if I was ready. Some kind of vision flashed before my eyes when I said yes. I somehow descended and experienced my own birth. Keep in mind that this was before I was able to comprehend what birth was, so I didn't even know about Native Americans yet. When I was about 6 or 7, I started getting very distinct mental images of something extremely disturbing. What I saw was a tanned, mummified-looking, emaciated, dead face. The eyes were glassy but somehow horribly alive, and the lips and nose were shrunken. The creepiest thing about the face was the 2 wide smiles and a full set of very white teeth. When I was 9 or 10, I read for the first time about some expedition or other in the Antarctic where several ill-fated members of an expeditionary group died and were left behind. Their bodies were recovered in the 20th century, and the article I was reading had images of them. I had never seen a frozen body before, but as soon as I saw those pictures, I immediately correlated what I was reading with the thing I'd seen earlier in life. From that point onward, I started having almost real waking visions. In a way that's hard to explain, more than just in my mind's eye, and yet not exactly as if it were actually in front of me. Of something that is basically my worst nightmare. It was an 8 to 9 foot tall, and I know this because its head almost touched the ceiling, frozen corpse, completely naked with long arms and legs. It was the same face I'd seen before in my mind, with shrunken features. Only now it had a full body that was just as emaciated and mummified as the head and neck were. I only saw it on cloudy days in the late fall or winter, and always when it was between me and a window, so it was sort of backlit. It never made any motion to do anything, it just stared down at me with a horrible grin. In high school, I got on Wikipedia at some point and finally learned what the thing was. The Wendigo. For those who don't know, it's a mythical spirit creature. I was born in Connecticut and have about 1% Native American blood in me from about 400 plus years ago. My first traceable ancestors in America came over shortly after the Mayflower, and one of them married a Native American woman. Now do you see the part why I'm so creeped out? Now, according to the legend, the Wendigo was an evil spirit associated with starvation, the winter, and cannibalism. It either lured desperate people into eating their fellow humans during the winter, or possessed those who did resort to cannibalism. There are various stories about how it looked, but most of them agree that it looks like a frozen corpse, generally taller than a human. And no, it doesn't have antlers like in all modern depictions you'll find via Google. It reportedly can ride on the winter wind, mimic human voices to lure the unwary into ambushes, and has a heart made of ice. But here's the thing though, I experienced this before I ever identified what the creature was or knew about the legends. Only after almost a decade of intermittently seeing the Wendigo did I come across this description. This description is from Wikipedia and follows. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tautly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, and unclean and suffering from suppurations of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay, decomposition, decay, and death. I've done my further research, and all of this information I found from various sources all concur what I saw. So, I'm remotely linked to the Native Americans with whom the legend oriented. I have always had a deathly fear of dead bodies, especially mummified-looking ones, and I saw a creature from their stories long before I learned that what I saw matched the traditional descriptions perfectly. I was, and still am, skeptical, but even I can't ignore these coincidences. I'm also a Christian, and therefore am quite wary of any claims of ghosts or supernatural entities inhabiting the world due to my beliefs. But even so, this thing has stuck with me for years, and I saw it earlier today, which is why I'm here. Anyone got any insight? I've considered seeking out a highly knowledgeable person to figure out what to do, but I'm torn because I also have some reservations about that from a religious perspective. Also, I promise this is sincere and not a fictional account. My wife and I have been running that rat race for years, with a family, a house in the city, 2 dogs, a cat, the stereotypical American dream. But the city did take its toll, and the neighborhood got worse. The crime rose, and we even found ourselves looking for a way out. Our opportunity came when I was offered a new job out of state. It was a great career move, but we didn't want to move to a new city just to have the same problems again. So we started looking around and found a great mountain community about an hour and a half from the job, and a great ranch-style house with a big back porch, windows everywhere, and a lot of property. The backyard has a big grassy area and a creek that cuts the property in half, and then acres of woods beyond. I mean, it's huge. The house is more than twice the size of our house in the city. It's all updated and has no neighbors within a mile. It's a radical change from the life we lived in the city, but best of all, it was less than half of what we were paying for our old house. The house was a foreclosure, and when we asked the listing agent about it, she simply said the old family had abandoned the property. We really didn't think anything of it, since those kinds of things happen like that all the time in apartment complexes when people don't have the ability to pay rent anymore. The first 3 months were pretty uneventful, with us settling into our new life, and the kids getting used to the new school and new friends, and most of all, us getting used to the big house and property. But then the weather turned cold and things started to get weird. It started with noises from the back property, things we chalked up to being in the woods. Then the motion lights around the house started going off randomly, and once again, we just chalked it up to being in the woods. But last night, that all changed. Last night was the most terrifying night of my life. One of the dogs was at the back door whining and scratching, and I just assumed he needed to go to the bathroom, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked out the back door. Instantly, something felt off. The dog bolted for the back property, growling and snarling. It was a cold night, about 30 degrees, but the dog plunged straight into the creek and out the other bank, running off into the woods in the back of the property. Flashlight bouncing, I ran after him, calling his name. I got to the creek and made my way across the makeshift bridge, trying desperately to follow him. I could hear the dog still growling and barking from somewhere up ahead, and I pushed further away from the safety of the house and deeper into the woods. And that's when I heard it, a shriek like I've never heard before in my life. It was a mix of a moaning wail and metal on metal. It echoed through the trees and froze me in my very tracks. My dogs bounded its way back to me and cowered down behind me. I turned around and could just make out the warm glow of the house behind me and the cold, dark ahead of me. I swung my flashlight around wildly, looking for the source of the noise, and that's when I heard an even more terrifying noise. Out of the cold silence, my wife's voice floated all around me. "Babe," the voice called out. I whipped back around and the noise could just barely make out the image of my wife, safely inside of her house. The voice called out again. "Babe, I'm right here," came the voice from deeper into the woods. Then came another voice, just as clear as the other, and it was my dad's voice. "Come out here," it called. I swung the flashlight around again, and this time caught the briefest glint of light bouncing off of eyes. The creature was in the beam of light for barely a second, but it was tall, maybe 6 feet, and ashen white. It had long, spindly fingers that grasped the trunk of a pine tree, and then it was gone. I turned back and ran towards the house. I ran headlong into the icy creek and stumbled. My dog ran past me, making it back to the yard and up the porch. I dug my hands into the freezing, muddy bank and pulled myself out, not stopping to even look back. When I reached the porch, I scrambled inside. My wife frantically ran over to me, asking what had happened. I just shook my head. I'm not certain myself what had happened. I had a growing sense of dread tonight as the sun began to fall. We kept the dogs inside, and I haven't dared to look out the back. But as I sit here typing, one by one, my motion lights in the backyard keep going off.